Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I want to thank the Farzanaz for having me here. The hospitality that I've been greeted with here in Oklahoma has been really very special. It's a beautiful state. It's the first time that I've been here. It's a real pleasure for me to come and talk with you guys. So I've been asked to give several talks with a focus on the Middle East. Today's talk is about what U.S. interests are in the Middle East. And I think you have to kind of think about that question in a number of ways. First of all, what are the interests of America in the Middle East that are cited by the U.S. foreign policy establishment? That's one way to think about the question. Another way to think about the question is what are America's actual interests in the Middle East? I think the answers to those two questions are different. And then more precisely, what are the policies that are actually necessary in order to secure these supposed interests? And I'll talk a bit about each of these things. So first, the conception of U.S. interests in the Middle East has changed over time. Back in the Cold War, for example, it was a major concern to keep the Soviet Union away from gaining a foothold or some kind of strategic controlling influence in the region. These days, I think that U.S. interests in the Middle East can be boiled down to three items: oil, terrorism, and the commitments that we have to traditional allies and against traditional adversaries. And I want to address each of these in turn, but I think first it's important to kind of take stock of what pursuing these interests has cost us. What does it actually involve to pursue these perceived interests in the region? Because over the past 30 years, pursuit of these interests has proven to be extremely costly, often tragic, frequently counterproductive to our stated objectives, and filled with failure. It's not a fun story. The Middle East is the only region of the world in which the overall U.S. troop levels and military activity increased and kept increasing steadily over time following the end of the Cold War. We drew down troops that were forward deployed in Europe, and same thing with Northeast Asia. But in the Middle East, we increased our base and troop presence there following the end of the Cold War, and our activity in there, in the region, has increased over time. One illustration of this, as the historian Andrew Bacevich put it, from the end of World War II to 1980, virtually no American soldiers were killed in action while serving in this region. And since 1990, virtually no American soldiers have been killed in action anywhere except this region. So the focus that we've had on this region for the past 30 years is exceptional. Another illustration that's kind of worth mulling over, to the extent that it's illustrative to think about how we keep doing the same thing over and over without updating it for the current strategic context or sort of revising things to work better. It has been roughly 27 years since the first Gulf War. We have bombed Iraq for every single year since then. American bombs have landed in Iraqi territory every year for 27 years. And I think that indicates that something is seriously wrong with our strategy. We currently have more than 50,000 troops in the greater Middle East region, what was identified in internal documents back in the Jimmy Carter administration as the region between Pakistan and Iran in the northeast and the Yemens in the southwest, and then west to the Mediterranean Sea. We have bases and troops in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Kuwait, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, even less advertised outposts and training facilities in Yemen, Oman, Saudi Arabia. That's virtually every country in the region. In the past 17 years or so of the post-9/11 war on terror, policies in the Middle East have cost roughly $5 trillion and hundreds of thousands of lives. So this is a very costly approach that we've had towards this region. Now, there's broad bipartisan support, roughly speaking, for these policies in Washington, D.C. It's, however, hard to find someone that can seriously back up the claim that America is better off for all of this. And that's essentially what I want to talk about today. So let's address and kind of scrutinize each of these three stated U.S. interests in the Middle East: oil, terrorism, and the commitments that we have to traditional allies and against adversaries. Let's start with oil. Of course, there's a cartoonish argument that American economic imperialism requires a physical military presence in the region to extract the region's oil resources. That's never really been accurate, but I mean, the argument essentially is that the U.S. presence in the Middle East, particularly the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, which enables the U.S. Navy to patrol the Persian Gulf waterway, through which roughly 30% of the world's seaborne traded oil flows. That presence is necessary in order to stabilize and ensure the free flow of oil, reassure global energy markets, and so on. The fear here is that wars or regional instability would undermine the free flow of oil, create volatility, send global oil markets, and thus the global economy into a tailspin. This is a wildly exaggerated fear. It's basically just wrong. I mean, oil is a fungible commodity traded on global markets and subject to the laws of supply and demand. Historically speaking, in every oil supply shock since 1973, disruptions in oil supply have had roughly sort of limited and fleeting effects on global oil prices. Major reductions or interruptions in any one source quickly triggers compensating increases in supply elsewhere. And the ability to handle disruptions of this kind has gotten easier over time, thanks to financial innovations that allow investors and consumers to hedge risks, as well as technology that has expanded production potential from previously inaccessible sources. Excuse me, I'm fighting a cold here. The conventional wisdom, at least in Washington, holds that U.S. oil interests in the Middle East are so significant and so vulnerable that it requires a major U.S. military commitment there. And I don't think that this stands up to scrutiny. For one thing, our own interventionism in the region is frequently the source of the wars and instability that we supposedly are protecting against. Furthermore, no country in the region and no country externally could plausibly gain any kind of monopoly, hegemonic control over the region's energy resources in the policy-relevant future. And so this competitive supply and demand function is pretty robust. Now, if we pan out to a long time scale, it's rather difficult to draw a causal link between oil supply stability and U.S. military presence. For much of the 1970s, there was no real external power occupying the region and protecting the free flow of oil, and yet this was a time of considerable expansion of output. In the 1980s, the U.S. got more involved in the region, but largely remained offshore. And then since 1991, we've had a considerable presence in the region. So we have these three different eras with three different postures and really no identifiable difference in supply or stability. One of the more discrete claims for the U.S. presence is that it deters a state like Iran from attempting to close the Straits of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which much of the world's oil supply flows. First of all, this exaggerates Iran's capabilities. I mean, it's not as if Iran has a kind of drawbridge that can, we could press a button and close off the passageway. It's actually hard to do. There are all kinds of practical obstacles. They would have to mine it significantly, and tankers these days are relatively resistant to these kinds of mines. It would be difficult to do effectively. But beyond that, the question ought to be asked, why in the world would Iran try to do something like this? After all, they export most of their oil through the strait, so they'd be damaging their own economic interests by doing this. And any sustained attempt to close the strait would likely mobilize an overwhelming international military coalition against Iran, likely worse than the one that was generated in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. And that prospect alone would threaten the survival of the regime. So this is not a scenario that Iran is eager to invite upon itself. You can imagine some situation in which there's a regional conflagration and they fear for their survival and they do something this reckless, but that's not something that's on the horizon unless we create it so. So the oil justification, I think, for the U.S. posture in the Middle East is pretty weak. Terrorism is the second one. The first thing that's important to point out here, I think, is that terrorism is probably the most egregiously inflated threat in the history of U.S. foreign policy. 9/11 was a traumatic event that led us to misinterpret the severity of the terrorist threat. The statistics that you've heard, that you may have heard about, are true. You are more likely, statistically speaking, to be killed by a stroke of lightning than to be killed by a terrorist attack here on American soil. More likely to drown in your own bathtub or be killed by falling furniture in your home, etc. This is a minor and manageable threat. It's not a war to be won. And for the most part, the application of military force is not all that effective a tool in mitigating this already limited threat. And it's frequently counterproductive to this goal. Some people might rebut that claim that I just made by pointing to the military effort against ISIS over the last several years, which has indeed been pretty effective in eviscerating and destroying that group. There are 2 points to make here. First of all, ISIS was unique from groups like Al-Qaeda in that it wanted to take and hold territory. This turned out to be a major strategic weakness because they could be more easily targeted. One of the benefits to groups like Al-Qaeda is that they don't have a return address. They're not staking a claim on a particular piece of territory and inviting counteraction. Furthermore, ISIS decided to set up shop rather stupidly in a piece of territory where they would be surrounded by enemies. The countries and groups fighting ISIS have included the United States, its Arab allies, Syria's Assad regime, Iraq, Iran, Russia, Turkey, Kurdish militias, several Syrian rebel groups. So ISIS was kind of destined for defeat just by its very nature. Secondly, ISIS can't be held up as an example of successful counterterrorism and military effort because ISIS was itself a result of U.S. military action. ISIS has its origins in the Sunni insurgency that rose up to fight invading and occupying U.S. forces in Iraq. And the previous iteration was AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They later morphed into ISIS. To put it in the rather blunt words of David Kilcullen, who worked on counterterrorism at the State Department during the Bush administration and was a senior advisor to General David Petraeus at the height of the Iraq surge in 2007 and 2008, quote, "There would be no ISIS if we had not invaded Iraq," end quote. At least among experts, this is not terribly controversial. The Iraq War and U.S. militarism in the Middle East, far from mitigating the terrorist threat in the post-9/11 era, was a major source of terrorism. In 2006, the National Intelligence Estimate, this is a report that all of America's intelligence agencies contribute to. Allegedly, there's 16 of them. I focus on this stuff every day. I think I can name maybe 7, but that should give you a sense of how authoritative it is. In 2006, at the height of the Iraq War, the National Intelligence Estimate found that the Iraq War was, quote, "shaping a new generation of terrorist leaders and operatives. It had become the cause célèbre of jihadists, breeding a deep resentment of U.S. involvement in the Muslim world and cultivating supporters for the global jihadist movement." Hard numbers bear this assessment out. In 2015, the number of fatalities from terrorism in the Middle East has increased by a staggering 397% since 2001. And in the 7 countries that the United States either bombed or invaded post-9/11, terrorist attacks rose by an astonishing 1,900%. Those numbers, if you want to double check me, are from the Global Terrorism Database from the University of Maryland, also cited in a recent Cato policy analysis. So there's really very little reason to believe that we need to be heavily involved in the Middle East, militarily speaking, in order to mitigate the terrorist threat. It's already a very minor threat, and our behavior in the region has actually exacerbated the problem rather than improving it. Finally, this issue of allies and adversaries. We're kind of stuck in place with our traditional set of allies and adversaries in the Middle East. For the most part, these are outdated relics of a Cold War era that haven't really been updated or revised for the current context. In the Cold War, Washington felt it was necessary to kind of head off close alliances between the Soviet Union and major Middle East countries. But today, I don't think that these alliances, in the way that they're currently conceived, yield much in the way of tangible benefits for U.S. interests. How is America better off, for example, for having given Egypt tens of billions of dollars worth of taxpayer money in the form of direct aid payments and a mountain of arms and military equipment over the past several decades? It certainly has helped keep a horrible authoritarian regime in power there, but it's not clear that it's been an asset in serving national interests for the United States. Actually, the prominence of Egypt as a U.S. ally has its origins in the Camp David Accords, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel that the United States helped facilitate. So in large part, our outsized support for Egypt is payment for Egyptian-Israeli peace, which is a strategic fact today that doesn't actually require continued U.S. aid to sustain. But this, of course, brings up the U.S.-Israeli alliance, probably the most significant bilateral relationship we have in the region. Supporting Israel is something of a matter of dogma in the United States, and questioning it, especially in Washington, D.C., where I live and work, a matter of heresy. But what do we get out of it? Israel certainly doesn't need U.S. protection. They're a virtual military hegemon in the region. They have the most sophisticated military and power projection capabilities. They have significant, their GDP per capita is way better than the average in the region. Not to mention they have a regional monopoly on nuclear weapons. No state in the region poses a plausible conventional military threat to Israel in the way that it used to in previous decades. Israel's rich and powerful enough to protect itself. And in fact, I'd argue that Israel is more often a strategic liability to the United States than an asset. And to the extent that we subordinate U.S. interests for the sake of Israel's in the region, this alliance undermines U.S. national security. It's probably wise to have a friendly relationship with Israel, as it's wise to have a friendly relationship with many governments in the region. But we should consider what the billions of dollars that we give them every year and all the intelligence sharing and the military equipment and so on, what that does for U.S. interests. Consider the moral consequences, for example, of U.S. support for a brutal military occupation of the Palestinian people, as well as the security problem this generates by, in the form of aggrieved terrorists. What about the Arab Gulf states? America's close relationship with Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Kuwait and Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. I think these are deeply problematic from the perspective of U.S. interest. Not only do we tend to exacerbate regional tensions by arming these states to the teeth with U.S. weapons and equipment, but they often act counter to U.S. interests. For example, many of these states have a long history of support for and promotion of extremist ideologies that manifest later as terrorist threats. Sometimes they make a show of cracking down on religious fundamentalism in their own societies, but they frequently play a kind of double game with the United States in this respect. As a classified yet leaked 2009 diplomatic cable said, quote, "Donors in Saudi Arabia constitute the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide." This problem extends to the very recent period. In 2014, the gaffe-prone Vice President Joe Biden sort of accidentally said publicly that, quote, "Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria," which was the breeding ground for ISIS. They were so determined to take down Assad that they poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of tons of weapons into al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. The Wahhabi doctrine that's promoted by Saudi Arabia around the world is virtually indistinguishable from that of ISIS, and this is our great ally. And consider recent events. I mean, for the past several years, Saudi Arabia has been engaged in a brutal air campaign against a largely impoverished and defenseless Yemen, the primary result of which has been to cause massive unnecessary humanitarian suffering on the part of the Yemeni population and to bolster the position of AQAP, or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Their efforts have been supported by the United States, despite how directly counter to our values and our interests this is. So I think we need to seriously rethink these relationships and at least take a step back in the sense of not being so closely aligned with them and developing more rational and moderate relationships with these countries to the extent that we can demonstrate that they tangibly improve U.S. interests. So then there are adversaries. I could talk a little bit about Syria's Assad regime, although I'm weary of getting down into the rabbit hole of the Syrian civil war. I think, by and large, Iran is the major adversary that we supposedly have to counter in the region. We're constantly bombarded by messages from politicians and television pundits and think tank analysts, not me, about what a grave threat Iran is. And to put it bluntly, I think this is hogwash. There are essentially three Iranian policies that are cited as a threat: their support for proxy groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, their development of ballistic missiles, and their nuclear program. None of these are a serious threat to the United States. That's a controversial statement in DC, but it happens to be true. Let's take them one at a time. The nuclear issue was settled, actually, in what was actually a remarkable achievement in the history of U.S. diplomacy. The Obama administration negotiated an agreement with Iran and the P5+1, that's the permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany, to significantly roll back Iran's nuclear program and verify its strictly civilian nature for the foreseeable future. Iran made pretty extraordinary concessions in this deal. They gave up 98% of their enriched stockpile of uranium, dismantled 2/3 of their operating centrifuges. They converted a number of their enrichment facilities into peaceful research centers. They agreed to cap their uranium enrichment to the lowest threshold and at only a certain amount, well below what's needed for weapons grade. They opened themselves up to what Yukiya Amano, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, has called the most intrusive and robust inspections regime in the world. And they agreed to a number of other restrictions, some of which expire over the course of 10, 15, 20, and 25 years. But the most important parts of this agreement are permanent. Iran agreed to ratify the additional protocol of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which provides for expanded inspections indefinitely. And they committed to never build nuclear weapons, a commitment which can be reliably verified through the inspections regime that they've submitted themselves to. The IAEA has released 9 reports since this deal has been implemented in excruciating detail, confirming that Iran is in full compliance with the terms of the agreement and that it is working as designed. And there is a virtual consensus among experts that the deal is working and that it is in U.S. interest to stay in it. The IAEA has said this multiple times. As I said, it's worth paying somewhat closer attention to what the IAEA says, because the last time a hawkish U.S. administration decided to ignore the assessments of the IAEA and go to war in the Middle East, we ended up with the Iraq War. So maybe let's not ignore them again. The P5+1, of course, say the deal is working and that we should keep to it. So that's all of our European allies, that's China, that's Russia. Defense Secretary James Mattis, no anti-war dove or lover of Iran. He's cited Iran as the major threat in the Middle East, and he fought Iranian proxy forces in Iraq during the Iraq War. He testified to Congress explicitly to say that it's in U.S. interest to stay in this deal and that the consequences for our abrogating it would be serious and detrimental. Former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster also said the same, another guy that was in the military during the Iraq War and fought Iranian proxy forces. Former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said the same. Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates, another Trump appointee, says this deal is working, it's in our interests. Withdrawing from it would be detrimental. General Joseph Dunford, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, one of the highest military officials in the country, said the same. General John Hyten, head of U.S. Strategic Command, said the same. The military and intelligence community has given these signals to Trump since the beginning of the administration, and Trump has not relented on his hostility towards the deal. Trump and a small cadre of ideologues, more of whom have either been hired or promoted in recent weeks, to high-level positions in his cabinet. They're resistant to these facts and determined to rip up the JCPOA, the acronym for the Iran nuclear deal, and get back on the path to conflict over a security concern that is at this point essentially a figment of their imagination. So Iran has no nuclear weapons program to speak of that's a threat to the United States, and it's in no way requiring a significant U.S. military commitment in the region. With regard to Iran's support for militant groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, these groups don't threaten the United States directly. They haven't committed terrorist acts against the United States either ever or in many decades. These groups have primarily local concerns. They arguably are a problem for some of our allies, but they could easily be made none of our business tomorrow if we took a different approach to the region. Recall that our own allies in the region, the Arab Gulf states I mentioned, but also Pakistan, Pakistan's long supported the very militant groups that we're fighting on a daily basis in Afghanistan, right? So if we can not only tolerate this kind of behavior from allies, not to mention support them as they do it, certainly Iran's rather limited support for these proxy groups that aren't a direct threat to the United States is not a real threat or reason to engage in constant counterbalancing against Iran in the region. Finally, there's a contingent of hawkish voices that believe Iran's development of ballistic missiles threatens the United States or our allies in the region. To reiterate a point I've already made in the past, our allies are, for the most part, largely capable of defending themselves. Iran doesn't possess and reportedly does not seek missiles that can reach U.S. territory. They can barely exceed the distance of their own region. The notion that Iran should be prevented from developing a domestic military capability like ballistic missiles, which countless states possess, assumes that they have no security concerns of their own, which is silly. They live in a dangerous region surrounded by adversaries. Iran's not likely to initiate a conventional attack against the United States or its allies. And America possesses an overwhelming nuclear deterrent. We remain the world's largest economy. We have a GDP 50 times that of what Iran has. Iran's annual military spending is only around 5% of ours, 9% of their region's total. This is not the hegemon that has sometimes been talked about. They have a large army, around 500,000 troops, but they can't meaningfully project power beyond their own borders. Bottom line, I think, is that Iran's regional behaviors are only a threat to the United States to the extent that we continue to insist on sticking our nose in a region whose strategic importance has been massively overstated for decades. So what are U.S. interests in the Middle East? I think they're rather limited. I think they're much more limited than the conventional wisdom would have us believe. I think we have an interest in the region's stability and the free flow of its energy resources to global markets. But we really don't have to do much in order to secure these interests. They mostly take care of themselves. U.S. interventionism is often more detrimental to these interests than helpful in securing them. I think the Middle East, to oversimplify it, doesn't really matter that much. It occupies a space in our strategic mindset that is vastly disproportionate to what I think it deserves. Especially for a very rich and very powerful country like the United States. I think by and large we ought to step back from the region and largely mind our own business. To the extent that our diplomatic power and our influence can improve specific disputes or issues, like it did with the Iran nuclear deal, I think we should engage in robust diplomacy and maintain relationships, but our military-centric approach is simply not necessary or even useful for our national interests. Thank you.